In what ways do you think smog impacts the economic lives of the poor, especially the labor class here in Pakistan?
There was that phenomenon of fog in Pakistan in the past, but in the years 2009, 2010, that started to be replaced by something called smog, which is not the normal fog that takes place during winter. This is outright air pollution. First of all, Pakistan does not have a GHG inventory, so we don't know what industry and what sector emits what.
We do know that smog is more like an annual phenomenon, but air pollution is a year round reality. Source appropriation study that singles out power producers, industry, and the transport sector as the biggest culprits.
Totally agree with the numbers that you presented. Vehicular emissions might be a very large contributor in Pakistan's overall emissions mix. But generally, if you look at the per capita vehicles that an average Pakistan has, or the number of vehicles that an average Pakistani has, I think the number is very very small. It's like 30 vehicles or 35 vehicles per 1,000 people in Pakistan. And I think that the same number is as high as something like 800 or 900 in the US.
Assalamu alaikum and hello. On New Wave Global, I am Faryal. According to the Air Quality Life Index developed by the University of Chicago, 98.3% of Pakistanis breathe air that is below the country's own national air quality standard. The same study says that air pollution shortens people's lives by almost 7 years in Pakistan's most polluted regions of Punjab and other provinces. In November last year, the air quality index in Lahore peaked at an alarming level of 409, prompting the Punjab government to mandate the closure of businesses and educational institutions while telling people to stay at home to stay safe. Now, businesses and traders might somehow afford this literally catch some fresh air indoor break, but for a majority of Pakistanis, especially the daily wagers, hawkers, traffic wardens, security officials, street sweepers, and sanitation workers, already crippled by back-breaking inflation amid a food insecure Pakistan, staying at home would mean going without the next meal and perhaps many subsequent meals. Now, those belonging to low income groups are hardest hit by the effects of smog as their economic lives entail being out and about every single day to make ends meet. For them, the only choice is between work or starvation, as toxic smog further exacerbates our city's divide between poverty and privilege. I'm grateful to Asad Ejaz Butt for joining me. Asad is a very familiar face on New Wave Global and Neo TV. He hosts shows on political economy. Asad is a development economist. He has provided energy consultancy and advisory services to many multilateral and bilateral donors, including the UN and USAID. In 2018, Asad joined the civil service of Pakistan, and he is currently working for the federal government. Asad, smog is being dubbed the fifth season of Pakistan, especially in Lahore and its surroundings. We witness an annual smog fest. Experts say that those suffering the worst from air pollution are not only those least responsible for it, but also the ones who are least able to cope with it. Now, in what ways do you think smog impacts the economic lives of the poor, especially the labor class here in Pakistan?
Thank you, Frayal, for having me. Yeah, this is a very, first of all, thank you for selecting this topic. I think it's a very pertinent issue in Pakistan, and one needs to discuss this. But before I come to your question, just a quick comment about the policy conundrum that exists in this sector, and why the government hasn't really taken the issue head on, and how it's not able to sort of make the kind of progress that we estimate that the government would make. Because if I correctly understand, this annual smog that takes place between the months of October, November, some parts of December, and now it's sort of this. I suppose I do not have data to back this, but this period is now expanding, it's elongating now. It's a much longer period than what it used to be in the past. I think, if I correctly recall, I mean, there was that phenomenon of fog in Pakistan in the past, but in the years 2009, 2010, uh, that started to be replaced by something called smog, uh, which is not the normal fog that takes place during winter. This is outright air pollution.
Hmm.
And for the past 10, 12 years, one thought that the government, especially the environment protection departments in the provinces, would be able to sort of devise policies that would get rid of this. But one policy that, sort of one mitigation policy in this sector is to, like you said, close industries in specific months of the year. But the big question is, does that really matter? And what sort of mitigation impacts would that create? First of all, Pakistan does not have a GHG inventory. So we don't know what industry and what sector emits what. We have like a total emissions count where we say that Pakistan, emits, I'm talking about carbon emissions here, Pakistan emits 0.9% of the global carbon emissions, but we do not know what emissions come from the industrial sector, what emissions come from the break-in sector, for instance, what part of the emissions come from the agriculture sector. And all of these, estimates are just pure estimates. There's no research study done on what sector contributes what. I was part of a project that looked at the industrial decarbonization potential of these sectors. But even those projects are done on very weak premises, because we're just essentially basing that information on speculative sort of or predictive kind of models, in which we think that a certain activity or a certain exercise done in the environment sector would have a certain mitigation potential, but we don't know exactly what that mitigation potential is. So a major cause of the smog that's taking place essentially is the residue burning in the wheat sector, not just in the agriculture sector, but in the wheat sector, because the essential or the big question to ask is, why does this only happen during these specific months? And the big answer is, and I think that is like the rational response, because essentially industries are working throughout the year. So, is there rationale in closing industries? Is there value in closing industries? Of course, I mean, there's a clear answer to this question, but is there a strong rationale in sort of regulating the crop residue burning activity, especially when it comes to sowing of wheat during the season? Because wheat is a rabi crop, and you would know that its sowing takes place in the months between October and December. I think in Punjab it takes place like a couple of weeks later. Uh, but yeah, so because Pakistan wheat is a large cash crop in Pakistan, it's a big exporting commodity, and of course there is very little leeway that the government has in sort of regulating the wheat sector, because given that this environment problem, and like you said, has great economic impacts, but the economic impacts on the other side are even perhaps greater. You don't regulate uh, these activities that contribute to smog, like crop residue burning. There is an economic cost, of course, that, and I'm coming to your question now, that lessens essentially productivity in the agriculture sector if you close industries. You pointed towards that in your intro. If you close industries, of course, there's a very large opportunity cost associated with what the industries produce, and some of these industries, like textile, which are very large contributors to Pakistan's meager exports, I mean, cannot be closed down. So there's a massive opportunity cost associated with closure of industries, especially in countries like Pakistan. Yes, there is a cost associated with regards to agriculture productivity. There's a cost associated with the closure of industries. Uh, but is there, the big policy question is that cost strong enough for the government to not do anything about it? And that's
Hmm.
been the status quo for the past 10 years. Should the government do something about it? If the government does it, is like, you know, are radical steps like closure of industries or preventing wheat crop residue burning are the right steps forward. I mean, there's no policy consensus on that, but clearly, given the health impacts, which, in my opinion, outweigh all of the other, you know, pros and cons of government regulations in the environment sector, clearly outweigh other concerns. And I think that becomes the biggest cause of concern. Yes.
So, Asad, like you pointed out, rightly pointed out, we do know that smog is more like an annual phenomenon, but air pollution is a year-round reality, and we
Yeah.
don't sort of tend to see it once the smog season departs. Now, the burning of crop residue that you just referred to prepare for the planting season, it worsens air pollution in winters. But fuel and energy sectors are among the primary polluters round the year. Now, I have a few statistics from a food and agriculture organization's source appropriation study that singles out power producers, industry, and the transport sector as the biggest culprits. The study says that vehicular emissions they contribute to almost 43% of the air pollution, followed by industrial emissions at 25% and agricultural emissions at 20% and burning of fossil fuels and coal to generate power at 12%. But all we hear the government talk about is blame the Indian farmers for stubble burning, or on our side of the border, we have our own farmers doing that as well. Is the government aware of, I mean, I'm sure they're aware, but do they recognize these real issues as well, that these are the ones that need to be actually taken care of?
Yeah, I think, thank you. That's a wonderful question. I mean, uh, um, you've asked me three different things, and I'll address each one of them
I'm sorry
separately. The
about
first is
that.
no worries. The first is the Indian issue. Of course, I mean there's a very strong political economy associated with this, uh, uh, but of course, climate is also a shared commodity, and I was talking to Adil Najam about this on the same platform a few months ago. And he said that there needs to be like a different lens of tackling the climate issue, and that lens can certainly not be a nationalistic, country level analysis cannot sort of support the kind of climate consensus that needs to be built. Even though he did agree with the fact that there's a strong policy element involved in this, which is where country leaderships have a strong role to play. But in either case, I mean, I do agree with the fact that this cannot be dealt at the level of cities or at the level of countries. So jurisdictional sort of divisions of the issue, of the climate issue, uh, are not a very sort of great lens of looking at the problem. But in either case, I mean, Delhi is, the closest big, large city in India. It's more congested than Lahore and other parts of some other parts of Pakistan's Punjab, which sort of gives rise to these kinds of speculations that it might be coming from India. But this is not based on any solid research. I mean, climate definitely is a shared commodity, but I would like to believe. I would like to believe in this argument if this is based on credible research. Uh, but I think the other two issues that you raised are more pertinent in this. One is the issue about vehicular emissions. Of course, I mean, we tend to sort of ignore the data. I mean, totally agree with the numbers that you've presented. Wind killer emissions might be a very large contributor in Pakistan's overall emissions mix, but generally, if you look at the per capita vehicles that an average Pakistan has, or the number of vehicles that an average Pakistani has, I think the number is very small. It's like 30 vehicles or 35 vehicles per 1,000 people in Pakistan. And I think that the same number is as high as something like 800 or 900 in the US, and
But,
similar
sorry,
numbers.
sorry to cut you short, Asad, but what about motorbikes and auto rickshaws? Those
Yeah, yeah.
actually use very
I mean,
substandard fuel, and also I think their emissions systems
yeah,
are faulty. That
yeah. I mean,
adds a very high percentage to
yeah,
the pollution.
yeah. I mean, even with those numbers, we're not looking at per capita transport higher. You could sort of infer that from per capita oil or fuel usage as well, which the motor rickshaw or even the motorbikes, the cars, all three of them would be using. So even with those per capita consumption of fuel numbers, we're much beneath the West. I think vehicular emissions are a major contributor, and even industrial emissions are a major contributor. But let's be honest about this. Comparing to countries in the West here that do not have a smog problem and do not have such, countries in the West do have an air pollution problem, but looking at data, I don't think that vehicular emissions or industrial emissions is a big cause of concern. I'd relay a story to you. At the Paris Agreement, which is one of the biggest agreements that have taken uh, place in the climate space so far. One of the bigger contentions of India's Prime Minister Modi, who was newly elected at the time, he was first elected in 2014 and then went to Paris. And he said that this it's very easy for post-industrialized nations to now tell us that stop industrializing because climate is a shared commodity and you're polluting the world and you're causing these health hazards for everyone else as well. So stop industrializing at the pace at which you're industrializing. And basically Modi meant that it's very easy for countries like the US, who are the champions of the global climate agenda, to sort
Mm.
of lecture us, China, to stop industrializing at this point, because this is exactly what they did back in the 50s, in the 60s, or even perhaps before that. So I mean, that, that argument had a basis, and it's very difficult for countries like Pakistan that are in the pre-industrial phase to basically stop industrializing at this point, because the economic costs, purely economic costs, I'm just not discussing health here, the economic costs of not industrializing are much greater than the economic costs that we would associate with air pollution or smog. Not discussing health, because it's very difficult to put a dollar value on health. But essentially, the argument that I'm making is that we would have to find other ways. Of course, air
Mhm.
pollution is a problem, smog is a big problem, but we would have find other ways which are less radical than closing industries to sort of solve the small problem. But one thing, Faryal, which is very important, because when you raise the issue of industrial emissions, I think something that needs to be looked into is the contracts that the government signed under the China-Pak Economic Corridor. At that time, like I said, government's big priority was to industrialize, was to increase exports, was also, of course, something that had very large-scale economic impacts, was especially in terms of industrial production and industrial productivity, was uh, the problem of load shedding in Pakistan. So back in the day when Pakistan in 2014-15 was negotiating the China-Pak Economic Corridor, uh, uh, the government did not pay attention to the fact that most of the power plants that it would be importing from Chinese companies were all coal-based power plants. So, which are a major cause of this smog. And
Yes.
like I said, this period has continued to elongate after that time, because some of these plants started functioning as uh, as late as 2018, and since then the problem has only exacerbated.
mm,
And of course, the government did not have, especially the federal government, did not have a climate focus at the time. The Ministry of Climate Change was not active. And of course, Pakistan doesn't have, it's like a beggars cannot be choosers situation, did not have a lot of sway over, the CPAC policy or when it came to government's dealings with China, which essentially meant that we were just, these power plants were just handed down to Pakistan, and we had to operate them the way they were. And essentially, I think that is also one of the major causes. But like I said, one would have to go back to wheat crop residue and brick kilns essentially, if one has to look into this, because brick kilns are very, very important. Sorry for a very long answer, but brick kilns are very, very important because one thing that people might not know about brick kilns, which is a big phenomena in certain parts of Punjab and a major contributor to carbon emissions and air pollution and so on and so forth, and also considered one of the major causes of smog, is that the brick kilns cannot operate in the rainy season.
mm.
So it's also not a summer phenomena when it rains more frequently. Therefore, it becomes their production activity, even though they produce round the year, but their production activity heightens essentially during uh, these months of September, October, November, and that basically sort of couples with the wheat crop residue burning during these months, which becomes like a major cause of smog. And essentially, then it becomes, like I said, it becomes like a policy problem, a policy conundrum for the government to decide whether they would like to close these activities, because essentially there's a huge opportunity cost associated with closure, or even perhaps mitigation activities have economic costs associated with
So,
them.
do we have any figures on the estimated economic burden of air pollution in Pakistan? The global economic costs of air pollution are estimated to run into trillions in the near future, as per the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It is estimated that it is going to be something like $25 trillion in terms of economic costs. Do we have any figures on Pakistan in that context?
Well, nothing that I know of. I mean, there would be some estimations done, I suppose so, because there's increasing interest in the area. Uh, there's a lot of climate research being carried on. I know that Pakistan is building with the support of World Bank, we're doing a few projects in which we're building the GHG inventory now. So uh, you know, uh, there's some measurement being done in this sector. So there's some studies that are uh, doing that kind of analysis. But I can't point. I mean, there's nothing which has gained coinage, or there's nothing that has become sort of known or mainstream to the level that people would generally come to know about it. Nothing that the government has, or the
Yeah.
Environment Protection Departments or Ministry of Climate Change have produced.
So I
Uh,
came,
yeah,
I came across this
sure,
World
sure,
Bank.
sure, sure.
There is
Please
this
go ahead.
World Bank report that estimates that the collapse of select ecosystem services could result in an annual decline in global GDP by
Yeah.
2030. And the report
Mm,
highlights that the sub Saharan Africa and South Asia would suffer the most in terms of relative contraction of real GDP, that which is going to
mm,
be around 9.7% annually due to the collapse of the ecosystem services by 2030, which should perhaps be a cause for concern here in Pakistan. Now, one of the connections between the economy and air pollution are higher costs of energy. The buildup of pollution can cause power production and distribution equipment to fail and require frequent repairs or replacement, leading to an
yeah.
increase in energy crisis. Now, for a country like Pakistan, which is already struggling with very high energy costs, and we are not very efficient in terms of our power distribution system, which leads to frequent power losses. Uh, Are we taking into account how air pollution is aggravating this power crisis? Because one thing which is happening very frequently in Lahore these days is that we are having very frequent power outages, which is usually a
Yeah.
summer phenomena. So I really don't know if smog has a role to play there. I mean, you're the expert. Maybe you can comment on that.
I mean, as far as the infrastructure requiring more frequent repairs and maintenance, I mean, that is linked to air pollution and smog, yes. But uh, but I think the current problem in Pakistan has its roots in public finance more than air pollution and energy, because the circular debt is piling up and government has some payments to make. But essentially, there could be like small impacts which are lesser known and not as visible. But 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 you raise a very valid point. I mean, even as somebody working in the sector, even though most of us know that uh, that there are sort of infrastructure repair and maintenance issues that are linked to air pollution and smog, but despite many people knowing this, I mean, this has never been the focus of the government or even perhaps focus of development sector partners in Islamabad. Uh, and we're not a nation that would fix problems before they occur. I mean, we would wait for the problem
Absolutely.
to exacerbate before we start addressing it. So essentially, no, there's not been any focus on this because the government is tackling a much bigger issue, which is to end the smog in the first place,
Mm.
and which is to sort of negotiate with the industry. If you recall, when load shedding was like a big phenomena, I mean, the government wanted to close factories, industries, shops, markets, retail outlets at around 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. in Punjab, and it faced a lot of difficulty doing that because, that is where the elite capture argument also comes in, because a lot of independent power plants, these big industries are owned by Pakistan's elite, who also have like a very strong domination over Pakistan's politics and
Mm.
parliamentary process. So therefore, it becomes very difficult to sort of do these things right away. But like I said, this is a classic policy conundrum because there are costs on both sides. I mean, if you look at the example that you just mentioned, if you regulate these coal power plants. I mean, you want to end smog and air pollution, but ending smog and air pollution means that you have to there is a very strong economic cost associated with replacing these power plants. An economy like Pakistan does not afford that. Uh, but should you not do anything about it? If you don't do anything about it, there'd be a much larger cost, like you mentioned, associated with the repairs and maintenance that will be required to these power plants. Similarly, in the industrial sector, if you don't do anything about it, essentially that means that there would be the economic costs associated with smog and air pollution that we've discussed. But if you do something about it, that means lesser exports. That means lesser industrial production, and like you mentioned yourself, that would be a great loss to the gross domestic product, not just Pakistan, but if it is done at a global level, there'd be massive losses to the GDP, and some of these things were discussed. This classic policy problem was discussed during the Paris Agreement, which is why this discussion took place, which is why some of these estimations of the loss to the global GDP were also carried out. So I think there is like a very sort of thin line between uh, doing or not doing something in this sector, because there are massive costs associated with government regulations on both sides, and therefore that is also one major cause of the inactivity that you see, the government inactivity in this sector, because essentially when the government is kind of torn, and even experts are torn between whether the government should close industries or partially close industries, or whether the government should do anything about negotiations that it does with the Chinese in the future regarding coal-fired power plants. uh, I mean, there is a lot of political expedience to not do anything about it, a lot of political convenience associated with not doing anything about it. Because when essentially the experts are torn and there are people on both sides, it's easy for the government to take a step back and say, okay, then we're not doing anything. But it doesn't say that explicitly, but that has been the status quo, and that's how matters are at this point. But yeah, but I mean, that repair and maintenance requirements that would come sort of in the future is like a valid concern, but there's no focus on that within the ministries of climate change or provincial
Hmm.
environment protection departments.
Yeah, but I was going through this report that the PTI government had set a target for Pakistan to generate 30% of its energy needs via renewable sources by 2030.
Yeah.
And last year, the National Electric Power Regulatory Authority noted that due to fossil fuels price volatility and decreasing cost of renewables, viable options for meeting the country's energy needs through more sustainable sources was possible. Do you think we can achieve such a target as it was set by the PTI government if subsequent governments are consistent in taking this up, and if there are no stark policy shifts, which I know is not something that comes very easy here, but do you think it's possible to move ahead in that direction, to move towards renewables?
It's definitely possible, but what would be the sources of, I mean, this
Solar,
figure, I think, comes.
wind,
Yeah. I mean, I understand. I mean, I understand what renewable would constitute, but when I say source, I'm essentially thinking about how the current, non-renewable sources would be converted. And because, like I said, and I've been mentioning this time and again during this interview, that there are massive costs associated with, these conversions and replacements of non-renewable sources to renewables. So, for instance, if I'm an independent power producer, the government invited me to do a bid. And let's just get into the public finance matters. Uh, I the government said that for the next 15 years or for the next 10 years, if I'm an investor, I set up an IPP, the government needs energy. I set up an IPP, the government says that we'd be buying 1 megawatt from your IPP for the next 10, 15 years at a so and so cost. I have set that plant up for the next 15 years. I've set that plant up, and lot of these contracts are long term contracts, because otherwise it's not the ROI, the return on investment is not feasible for any private investment investor in the energy sector. So I don't know if you saw that, but when the when the Shehbaz Sharif government's sworn in April of 2022, they basically invited a lot of bids for IPPs to set up, but there was no mention of green energy or renewable energy, which is indicative of the fact that, even contracts that the government is signing at this point are not based on the condition of the IPP sort of setting up a green power plant. Uh, but like I said, I mean, it's not possible for the government at this point to renegotiate. Like I said, Chinese projects, a lot of them are like hardwired into the system. They are hardened contracts that the government has already signed for the long term, and it would be very difficult for the government to either divest from those projects, or even perhaps the Chinese are really adamant about changing conditionalities within these contracts. So it's very difficult for the government to renegotiate their contracts with IPPs or the Chinese. So I don't think that even though this number that you mentioned comes from the climate change policy, that we would have 30% renewable sources until 2030, but 2030 is just 6 years away. At the time when the policy was made, 2030 was
yes.
8 or 9 years away. I think it came out in 2021, if I'm not wrong. So, I mean, 8 or 9 years was a very, very small time sort of horizon to make such big structural changes in the sector. And looking at what Pakistan has achieved in the last 9 years, or perhaps in the
Hmm.
last 20 years, when this became like a global phenomenon, I
Yeah,
don't expect big changes to be made in the next 9 years. Yes, please.
but what we are doing at the moment, the government policies which aimed at combating are usually made in haste, and they seem more like knee-jerk reactions rather than a long-term policy. For example, the enabling when they wanted to enable the artificial rain, or even closing markets or schools 3 days a week, that is not going to help the smog issue or the air pollution issue in the long run. We do understand that. The fuel that Pakistan uses falls under the Euro 2 category of the European Union standards, which is a significantly lower quality fuel compared to has been recommended as the Euro 6 category. Now, under the brownfield refinery policy 2023, it necessitated Pakistan to facilitate the existing refineries to move towards producing Euro 5 compliant fuels. Refineries are required under this policy to start producing quality fuel, and even at the provincial level, the government has announced the imposition of embargoes on those who are supplying Euro 2 fuel. Why has there not been much progress in this regard as well?
Well, I'm not sure what the status is right now. I know that the government came up with this regulation, but I do not know, whether or to what scale has the government been able to crack down on those not complying with its regulations. Uh, but yeah, I mean, when you talk about such things, there's like a pervasive capacity problem, regardless of what sector we're discussing. And even though regulators within the energy sector, because the government has a stronger monopoly in this sector and a stronger monopoly over the production of fuel, essentially, because the government has the only largest refinery in the country when it comes to petrol and diesel and those kinds of fuels. So essentially, given the monopoly status of the government has, the regulatory bodies in this sector, for instance, OGRA, are much stronger regulatory bodies than, say, regulatory bodies in the education sector, for instance, where the government does not have a very strong monopoly. So I'm not sure I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the crackdown status is, or how effectively has the government implemented these regulations. I might need to look into that, but
Mm.
essentially, if you say that not much progress has taken place, I can only point to, capacity of the regulatory institutions, and, essentially, what amount of power do they have over the private sector is, I think, a critical concern. But I think even within such sectors where the government has a strong monopoly and regulatory bodies are strong, I mean, some policy areas, regulators do not have a strong focus. It's not a priority, and maybe perhaps this is not a priority of the regulator in the fuel sector at the moment. It could become one in the future. For instance, this is the only sector, the fuel sector in Pakistan, if the regulator, even in a country like Pakistan, where there's a very strong instance of shirking, there is outright compliance that the private sector shows with the government. You look at uh, price changes. Sometimes the private companies are not agreeing to the price change, but the moment OGRA notifies a price change, even if it's like a radical price change, within a few seconds, all retail outlets in the country, all pumps in the country, all petrol stations in the country update to the new price without even the OGRA regulators uh, raiding their stations or raiding their sites, and nobody looks into this. This is like a big phenomenon in a country like Pakistan, where shirking of the private sector with government regulations, private sector not complying with the government is a regular phenomenon. It's a norm. But within this sector, it has never become a norm because regulations are very, very strong. And this is indicative of the fact that if a powerful regulatory body like OGRA might want to do something, if they do want to sort of implement a certain change.
So in the big cities, Asad, it's the poorest who live in cramped, informal settlements, often near rubbish dumps or other sources of pollution, and they feel the full impact of air pollution. Sometimes there are huge smoldering dump sites right next to schools and clinics and shops, and they have this daily exposure to toxic fumes from the dump. There's also indoor air pollution for these people due to the burning of wood and charcoal and kerosene inside these poorly ventilated homes for cooking and heating. These people, they cannot afford cleaner fuels or alternative technologies. They have fewer resources to relocate. There are no green spaces, all of which can cause psychosocial distress and chronic stress. So, can we say that mental health, in addition to, of course, physical health, which we know is certainly affected by air pollution and smog, can we say that mental health can also be somewhat affected by constant exposure to air pollution? There have been some studies which I was going through that there is evidence of diminished individual cognitive capabilities if you are constantly exposed to air pollution. So, what is your take on that?
I mean, I've not looked at studies that talk about mental health issues, but I mean, thinking about it uh, as an individual, I think, uh, and in my discussions with people, people are generally affected both ways, and I think I don't know how important the issue of proximity is because essentially people living close to these these dumping sites that you mentioned, or people perhaps living close to where the agriculture waste is being burned are also affected regardless of their economic status. I mean, the rich are also affected alike because they are breathing the same air, but they have stronger firewalls erected. That's where the difference comes. The poor person does not afford good health care. Uh, uh, their health, I think, the bigger concern is not even them affording great health care, even though that's a big issue. I think an even bigger issue is that their health is not being monitored and therefore not recorded. If you look at various studies about health and you want to zoom in on Pakistan's bottom 40% or bottom 20%, you would not get credible statistics. I was doing this study in the district of Sheikhupura in the health sector, and there were little health statistics that were disaggregated by economic status, uh, essentially because there was no focus on the poor, but also perhaps because a lot of times these small clinics or these quacks that the poor person affords, essentially they have no databases. They're not asking them to fill any registration forms. They do not have the resources to go to labs and conduct tests, which provide us certain baselines about health. And because essentially there is no baselining in the health sector, there is no monitoring in the health sector. You don't know if a certain person before was sort of facing a certain health issue in the months of say September or October, did that exacerbate in the months of January or February when the person faced smog, or when the person moved into a locality in a slum which had a dumping site nearby? You don't know whether health improved or did not after a certain period of time. I mean, these kind of studies need to be carried out. But since we do not have specific data, we're just going by logic. And I think the logical way of looking at this is that, of course, essentially there are there could be both mental and physical health issues associated with smog. Physical health issues are even perhaps bigger. I mean, you talk about mental health issues which are less visible, but or could be greater but less visible. But physical health issues are far greater in terms of being more visible, essentially,
Yes.
and have been the subject of government policy as well, because essentially uh, there are great skin issues that are caused. I've heard a skin doctor say, and I mean, it's very sadistic of him to say that, but I've heard doctors say that, like there is the wedding season is very lucrative for the wedding hall industry. This smog season is very lucrative for skin specialist doctors in Lahore and in Punjab, because that is when they make money. So they think that those 3 months of the year is season for their business, uh, uh, which, as sad as that is, it is very true. And I think the physical health issues are more visible. And one uh, they become one great contributor to people leaving the country as well. So, I mean, while you're focusing on the poor, I mean, there's this capable Pakistani class, people who went to universities, are educated, are professionals, who are leaving the country just because there is a big health hazard during the 3 months. I recall a doctor telling me, a qualified doctor telling me that, the environment is polluted in Pakistan. And it's become so bad in Pakistan that, come the months of September and October, you start taking anti allergies. You go to
Mm.
pharmaceutical places and you talk about certain drug names which are anti allergies. You would see that their sales far outweigh sales of any other medicine. And uh, other than paracetamol, I mean, I think anti-allergies in Pakistan would be the second highest selling medication, especially during these months when people are catching these cold and flu type issues as well. So you talk to doctors and they say, ever since smog became a phenomena, you start taking anti-allergies even before you are feeling sick during the months of September and October. So that's how bad the situation is, and people are
Yes.
people are leaving the country. I mean, uh, health is such a big issue, uh, even much bigger than employment. That in the past there was little job creation, the economy is failing, but people who are patriotic Pakistanis still wanted to hang on, but now they're just leaving the country because they are falling sick. Their children are falling sick. Uh, Almost half the year we have this phenomena of smog. The other times of the year, like you mentioned, the air
Air
quality is still
pollution.
bad.
Yes.
You cannot breathe. You have skin issues. People are just leaving the country. I mean, and that's, I think, one big economic cost associated with it.
It is. It is. It causes so many physical ailments. There's coughing, there's sneezing,
Yeah,
respiratory ailments, asthma. People with asthma get more affected, bronchitis, and cancer in very extreme cases. It can cause lung cancer and chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, and very such diseases that can really affect they're a threat to your life, not just about inconvenience, but about life-threatening diseases, because these air pollutants, they impair the blood vessel function in a lot of cases. Economic
yeah,
benefits which are associated with air pollution mitigation certainly outweigh its costs by a great factor. Its impacts on the workforce and productivity are immense. Considering that Pakistan's economy is already struggling to stabilize for quite some time and faces innumerable challenges, pollution induced dampeners are the last thing that we need. Asad, I thank you very much for your professional input and your time. Thank you for watching. Allah Hafiz and goodbye.